A nurse hears a patient whisper, "Don't let them take me," and uncovers a shocking betrayal that will make you question everyone you trust. Emma Cooper had worked the night shift at Riverside Hospital for 8 years. She thought she'd seen everything. She thought she'd seen every kind of fear a human could wear on their face, but she had never seen terror like this. It was just after midnight on a Tuesday, the kind of Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday, heavy, slow, and endless. Emma moved from room to room with her medication cart. The wheels squeaked. Always that same squeak on the left side. She hummed under her breath, some song from the radio she didn't even like, just something to fill the silence, something to keep her awake, keep her moving, keep her from thinking too hard about how many hours until sunrise. Room 212 was her last stop. She pushed the door open gently, expecting to find Theodore Ashford asleep like most patients at this hour. Instead, he sat upright in bed, wide awake, staring at the door like he'd been waiting for something terrible to walk through it. Theodore wasn't like her usual patients. Most of the elderly people on this ward were weak, confused, lost in the fog of their own minds. They mistook her for daughters they hadn't seen in years, asked what decade it was, called out names of people who'd been dead for decades. But Theodore was different. His eyes were sharp, alert. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who'd built his own life with his own hands. According to his file, he used to be an architect before retiring. He was recovering from hip surgery. Smart, independent. The kind of man who measured twice and cut once. Emma was about to give him his evening medication when he suddenly reached out. He grabbed her wrist. She jumped, her breath catching in her throat. "Mr. Ashford?" she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. His hand trembled violently, but his grip was strong. Desperate. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated, searching her face like he was looking for something specific. Something that would tell him whether she was safe, whether she would listen, whether she would believe. "Don't let them take me," he said, his voice barely audible. "Please, Emma, don't let them." Emma's heart started beating faster. She forced a reassuring smile, the kind she'd practiced 1,000 times for frightened patients. "It's okay, Mr. Ashford. No one's taking you anywhere tonight. You just need to rest." But Theodore shook his head hard, his eyes darting toward the door and back to her face. "You don't understand. They're going to take me away. You have to believe me. I'm not crazy." Emma gently tried to pull her wrist free. She'd seen this before. Elderly patients terrified by shadows. Patients convinced their families were plotting against them. Usually, it was the painkillers talking, or just the crushing fear of losing their independence. "You've had a long day, sir," she said softly. "Sometimes the medication can make things feel confusing. Try to get some sleep, okay?" Theodore eventually let go of her hand, but the fear in his eyes didn't fade. It burned there like a candle flame that refused to die. He stared at her for a long moment, then turned away toward the window. Emma finished giving him his pills and left the room, but something about his expression followed her down the hallway. Something about the way he'd said her name, like it was the last word he'd ever speak. The next morning, the ward looked different. Sunlight streamed through the windows. Everything seemed normal again, as if the darkness had taken all the fear with it when it left. Theodore's daughter, Victoria, arrived at her usual time carrying a fresh bouquet of yellow flowers. She looked every bit the perfect, loving daughter. Tall, elegant, always dressed in soft beige colors that whispered money and respectability. She greeted the nurses with polite smiles, brought her father his favorite biscuits, laughed at all the right moments. But her smile never reached her eyes. "Good morning, Dad. How's my favorite patient today?" From the doorway, Emma watched as Theodore gave her a small, stiff nod. The moment Victoria stepped into the room, his whole body went rigid. His jaw clenched like he was biting down on broken glass. His fingers twisted the bedsheets like he was trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. Victoria arranged the flowers in a vase, chatting brightly about the weather, her work, the neighbors. But Theodore barely responded. Emma noticed how his shoulders hunched forward, like he was trying to make himself smaller, invisible. A few minutes later, Victoria's husband Richard arrived. He looked like success in an expensive suit, slicked back hair, leather shoes that probably cost more than Emma made in a month, a confident smile that never wavered. He always carried a leather folder full of papers and spoke about financial matters like they were the most natural thing in the world. Emma watched him sign papers at the nurse's desk while chatting casually with the doctors about Theodore's care. "Dad's mental state is getting worse," she heard him tell Dr. Martinez. "We should think about moving him to the memory care unit soon." Emma's heart skipped. She quickly glanced at Theodore's chart hanging on the wall. There was nothing written about mental decline, no notes about confusion or memory problems. Theodore had been alert and coherent every single time she'd spoken with him. Something didn't add up. When Victoria and Richard left, Emma stood in the doorway, thinking. She'd seen families struggle with difficult decisions before. Sometimes they argued. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they fell apart under the weight of watching someone they loved slip away. But she'd also seen another kind of family. The ones who smiled sweetly in public while quietly doing terrible things in private. Which kind were they? Over the next few days, Emma started paying closer attention to Theodore. She wasn't assigned to his care anymore, but she found excuses to walk past his room throughout her shifts. Checking supply closets that didn't need checking, taking the long route to the break room. She began to notice a pattern. Every single day, the same routine unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Victoria arrived in the mornings with flowers and warm smiles for the nursing staff. Her husband Richard came at lunchtime with his folder of papers. He'd sit by the bed, whisper something to Theodore in a voice too low for anyone else to hear, then guide his trembling hand to sign documents before leaving quickly. In the evenings, their teenage daughter Melissa would visit and read to him from the same book, always in a flat, rehearsed voice. To anyone else, they looked like the perfect caring family. But Emma noticed what others didn't. Theodore never smiled when they walked into his room. His shoulders would stiffen like he was bracing himself for a blow. When Richard put papers in front of him, Theodore's hand would shake. Not from weakness, but from something that looked like terror. One afternoon, Emma walked in quietly with medication and heard Richard speaking in a low, angry voice that sent chills down her spine. "You signed this, old man. Stop making things difficult. You don't even understand your own money anymore." The moment he saw Emma, his tone changed, like flipping a switch. Suddenly he was friendly and polite again, asking about Theodore's comfort, commenting on the nice weather. Emma started noticing other things too. Bruises on Theodore's wrists that looked like fingerprints. The way he flinched when Richard touched his shoulder. And always, his eyes would find hers across the room with a look of silent pleading. One night, Emma couldn't ignore it anymore. When her shift ended, she went back to Theodore's room instead of going home. The hallways were dark and silent, filled with the kind of quiet that made footsteps sound like thunder. Theodore was awake, staring at the ceiling with wide, frightened eyes. "Mr. Ashford," she whispered, closing the door softly behind her. "I'm listening now. Tell me what's really happening." For a moment, he just stared at her like he didn't trust his own voice, like the words might disappear if he tried to speak them. Then they came, slow, trembling, heavy with the weight of months of pain. "After my wife died," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "Victoria came over every day. She said she didn't want me to be lonely. She handled my bills, cleaned my house, made my meals. I thought I was lucky to have such a caring daughter." His voice cracked like old wood. But it wasn't care. It was control. He looked down at his hands, studying them like they belonged to someone else. "Victoria started taking my mail. Said I shouldn't worry about confusing letters. Then she said my driving was unsafe and sold my car. She told the neighbors I had memory problems. The next thing I knew, all my accounts were in her name. She said it was to simplify things. He swallowed hard, the sound echoing in the quiet room. She would scold me like a child if I asked about my own money. And Richard, he'd laugh. He'd say I should be grateful that someone was keeping me alive. His voice began to tremble. They would hide my phone, take my reading glasses so I couldn't read important documents. When visitors came to the house, they would lock me in my room, telling people I was too unwell to see anyone. He wiped a shaking hand over his face. When I told them I wanted to move back to my own house, Victoria's face changed. She looked at me like I was something disgusting she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. Richard grabbed my arm so hard it bruised. 2 days later, I argued with him about my money at the top of the stairs. Then, I remember falling. I don't remember hitting the ground. Tears ran down his cheeks like rain on weathered stone. I woke up here with a broken hip. They said I tripped. But I didn't trip, Emma. He pushed me, and now they're trying to put me away in some facility where no one will ever believe me again. Emma reached for his hand without thinking. His skin was cold, paper thin, but his grip was surprisingly strong. I believe you, she said softly. For the first time since she'd known him, Theodore's shoulders relaxed. The fear in his eyes faded just slightly, like clouds parting to let in a single ray of sunlight. Thank you, he whispered. Everyone else thinks I'm confused. The doctors, the nurses, even the neighbors back home. But I remember everything. The pain, the fear, the way they looked at me like I was already dead. The next morning, Emma went straight to Janet, the hospital's senior social worker. Janet was a no-nonsense woman who'd been dealing with family problems for over 20 years. Her office walls were covered with thank you cards from families she'd helped and certificates she'd earned fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. I'm worried about a patient, Emma said, sitting down across from Janet's cluttered desk. Theodore Ashford in room 212. I think his family might be abusing him. Janet's tired eyes became sharp and focused, like a hawk spotting movement in tall grass. That's a serious accusation. What makes you think that? Emma explained everything. The fear, the bruises, the financial papers, the threats about a care facility, the way Theodore's whole body language changed when his family was around. Janet frowned thoughtfully, tapping her pen against her notepad. His file says mild cognitive decline. That makes accusations like this complicated. Has any doctor examined him alone, without his family present? Emma asked. Janet paused, then picked up her phone. That's a very good question. Let's find out. Within a few days, a secret investigation began. Janet arranged for Theodore to meet privately with Dr. Peters, a psychologist who specialized in elder care. Dr. Peters was a gentleman with kind eyes who had a gift for making people feel safe enough to tell the truth. When Dr. Peters emerged from his meeting with Theodore 2 hours later, he looked pale and shaken. He's not confused at all, he told Janet, his voice tight with anger. He's terrified. Every detail he gave was consistent and clear. This man is completely mentally sound. He's been systematically manipulated and abused by people he trusted. Janet called Adult Protective Services immediately. The APS investigator, Mrs. Lewis, arrived at the hospital the next day pretending to be an auditor reviewing patient records. She quietly examined Theodore's files, asked innocent questions about billing procedures, and looked into his financial documents. What she found made her stomach turn. Victoria had transferred over $500,000 from Theodore's accounts into joint accounts she shared with her husband, Richard. His pension payments had been redirected to her address, his house, the house he'd lived in for 40 years, where he'd raised his children and buried his wife's ashes in the garden, had been sold months earlier with his signature forged on the deed. Worse still, there were medical records showing that Victoria had been collecting strong sedatives and painkillers under Theodore's name, medications he'd never been prescribed. She's been drugging him, Mrs. Lewis said, her voice filled with disgust, keeping him drowsy and confused so no one would question her version of events. Janet called Emma that evening with the news. You were right. He's been abused, both financially and physically. But we have enough evidence now to act. It didn't take long for Victoria to sense that something was wrong. One afternoon, she stormed into the hospital administrator's office with her lawyer in tow, demanding answers. She had somehow discovered that an inquiry had been opened, and she wanted to know why. "My father is delusional," she said loudly, her voice echoing down the hallway. "If this hospital has been encouraging his paranoid fantasies, we will take immediate legal action." That afternoon, Emma was called to her supervisor's office. The atmosphere was tense and cold, like walking into a freezer. "Emma, did you make formal accusations against the Ashford family?" "I reported my concerns about a patient's safety," Emma replied, keeping her voice steady despite the way her heart was hammering. "That's my professional responsibility as a nurse." "Your job is patient care, not playing detective," her supervisor said sharply. "The Ashfords are threatening to sue the hospital for defamation and emotional distress." Before Emma could respond, Janet appeared in the doorway carrying a thick folder of documents. "Let them sue," Janet said calmly, walking into the room like she owned it. "We have evidence." She spread the proof across the desk like playing cards. Bank transfers, forged property deeds, prescription records that showed medications being ordered for a patient who'd never been prescribed them. Dr. Peters' psychological evaluation that clearly stated Theodore was of sound mind. "Theodore Ashford is not confused," Janet said firmly. "His daughter and son-in-law have stolen his life savings, sold his home without permission, and forged his signature on legal documents. They've also been drugging him to keep him compliant and confused." The room fell completely silent. 2 days later, the police arrived at the hospital. They went to Theodore's room first, 2 officers who spoke gently and assured him that he was safe, that justice was finally coming. Theodore cried when they told him. Not from fear this time, but from relief so overwhelming it shook his entire body. Then they went to the visitors' lounge, where Victoria and Richard were waiting for their usual afternoon visit. When the officers informed them they were under arrest for fraud, forgery, theft, and elder abuse, Victoria screamed. "You can't do this. He's my father. Everything I did was to help him." Richard immediately threw Victoria under the bus. "It was all her idea. I just signed what she told me to sign. I didn't know half of what she was doing." The officers handcuffed both of them and led them away, while patients, families, and hospital staff watched in stunned silence. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the horror Theodore had endured. For nearly 2 years, he had been treated like a prisoner in his own daughter's home. His meals were strictly rationed. His medication was increased whenever he tried to assert himself or ask questions. His phone calls were monitored, his mail was hidden, and visitors were turned away with lies about his health. The most heartbreaking part wasn't even the money they'd stolen. It was the emotional betrayal. "They treated me like I was already dead," Theodore told the investigators, his voice hollow with pain. "My own daughter, the child I raised and sacrificed for, looked at me like I was nothing but a burden to be managed. There's no pain worse than being rejected by your own blood." In court, the evidence was overwhelming. The forged documents with handwriting analysis proving the signatures weren't Theodore's. The stolen pension money that had been funneled into Richard's business accounts. The sedatives found in Theodore's blood tests. Security camera footage from the day of his fall that clearly showed Richard pushing him down the stairs when he thought no one was watching. Victoria tried to cry and claimed she'd only wanted to protect her aging father. The judge wasn't fooled. "You robbed your father of not just his money, but his dignity and freedom," the judge said, her voice cold with contempt. "You poisoned the sacred bond between parent and child for your own financial gain. This court will not tolerate such cruelty toward our most vulnerable citizens." Victoria was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Richard received 5 years. Their house was seized to repay the money they'd stolen. Their daughter Melissa was placed with Victoria's sister, who promised to raise her with the values of respect and kindness that her parents had abandoned. 2 weeks later, Theodore was discharged from the hospital. Not to a locked memory care facility where he'd be forgotten and ignored, but to a comfortable assisted living apartment he had chosen for himself, in a building with gardens and a library and people who treated him like the intelligent, capable man he was. He was still frail and walked with a cane, but his eyes were bright and alert again. The fear was gone, replaced with something Emma had never seen in him before: peace. Emma came to say goodbye before he left. Theodore took her hand in both of his, and she was surprised by how warm his skin felt, how steady his grip was. "Thank you for listening," he said, his voice strong and clear. "For believing me when no one else would." Emma smiled, feeling tears threaten at the corners of her eyes. "I almost didn't. I almost decided it wasn't my place to get involved." "But you did," he said, squeezing her hands gently. "You saw me as a human being when my own family saw me as an obstacle. Money can be replaced, but trust and love, when those are broken, the piece is cut deep. Your kindness reminded me that there are still good people in the world who won't look away from suffering." Emma felt the tears spill over. "You deserve peace and happiness now, Mr. Ashford." "Thanks to you," he said. "I finally have both." After Theodore left, life at the hospital returned to its normal rhythm. Some of Emma's colleagues whispered that she had overstepped her boundaries, that she should have minded her own business. Others quietly called her brave, a hero who'd saved a man's life. Emma didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who'd simply done what was right when it would have been easier to look away. Months later, she learned that Victoria's appeal had been rejected, and her sentence upheld. The news barely made the local papers, just a small article about financial elder abuse that most people probably skipped over to read about sports scores or weather forecasts. But it was enough. Justice had been served. That night, as Emma drove home from her shift, she stopped at a red light and looked up at the stars scattered across the dark sky like tiny promises. Somewhere out there, Theodore was probably doing the same thing, safe, free, at peace for the first time in years.